Hey, welcome to 12 Tones. Stevie Wonder's classic period is one of the most impressive accomplishments in the history of popular music. It began when he turned 21 and his childhood contract with Motown Records expired, allowing him to negotiate a new deal that reflected his status as a superstar and ended with, among other things, him winning Album of the Year at the Grammys 3 times in 4 years with 3 consecutive albums. For context, the only other artist who's ever even come close to that was Frank Sinatra. Wonder was unambiguously on top of the world. The classic period began with 1972's Music of My Mind, but most fans agree that the real turning point, the album that showed just what Stevie Wonder was capable of when you gave him full artistic control, was his follow-up, Talking Book, released that same year, which contains one of his most enduring songs, Superstition. Let's take it apart. Superstition is an interesting song to analyze because for the most part, if you set aside the vocals, it's kinda just the same 2 bars repeated over and over. Or okay, that's not quite fair. Well, the song is mostly a 2-bar loop. That looping effect isn't a studio trick. Wonder, and yes, besides the horns, every part of the song is played by Stevie Wonder himself, played through the whole thing on each instrument, and it's full of little fills and flourishes to keep things interesting. Sometimes the drums sound like this, and other times it's more like this. For the sake of keeping this video to a reasonable length, I won't be examining every flourish in every single bar, but I do think it's worth recognizing that part of what makes this song great is Wonder's incredible ability to improvise within a groove. But the relatively short repeating structure gives us a unique opportunity to zoom in on that single 2-bar phrase and really take it apart piece by piece to understand how it all fits together, and what better place to start than with the heart of any good groove, the drums. We can split this up further into 3 separate parts. First, there's the kick, playing a 4 on the floor rhythm, which means it's hitting on every beat like a metronome. This serves as like a rhythmic anchor, giving your body something consistent to move to. The kick also plays a lot of grace notes, tossing in an extra hit, a 16th note before the main attack, so even though it's hitting all the beats, you're still getting syncopation. Here, listen to it again and really focus in on that bass drum. And while we're here, let's move on to the next drum, the snare. This part is pretty straightforward, but it's also the most important because Wonder's snare is just rock solid on the backbeat. He plays some fills here and there, but for most of the song, he's just hitting on beats 2 and 4. This may seem obvious to those of you who already know about funk drums, but I want to highlight it because I think it's natural to assume that if you want to make a groove funky, you should be syncopating as much as possible, but that's not really true. I mean, don't get me wrong, a good funk groove should have plenty of syncopation, but that doesn't really mean anything unless you have something to syncopate against, some prominent part that marks out where the hits are supposed to go so you can really feel them landing somewhere else. That's usually the snare's job, and Wonder is giving us a masterclass. And finally, we have the hi-hat, which Wonder leaves partially open, giving it a loose, jangly sound. The hi-hat groove is based mostly on this figure, although I cannot stress enough how much of a simplification that is. Again, Wonder takes a lot of liberties playing around with the groove as the song goes, and I wouldn't be surprised if no 2 bars of hi-hat were exactly the same, but most of them at least sort of resemble this pattern, so I'm just gonna roll with it. This is the busiest of the 3, and it helps to fill space in the groove. The snare is intentionally sparse, and the kick is mostly on the beats, so the majority of the sound the drums are making comes from this hi-hat, and it emphasizes another important aspect of the groove. Wonder is swinging his 16ths. This means that instead of playing straight ahead, where every attack is the same length, he's taking each pair of 16th notes and pushing the second one back a bit. Swung 16ths are a common trick in funk to make the groove feel more alive and less stuck to the rigid forms of the bar. It creates a rhythmic space that's easier to lose yourself in because you don't really have to worry about the clear hierarchic structure of a straight-ahead beat. It sounds more like a party than a recital. This swing feel is especially interesting in regards to the hi-hat pattern he's playing. We've got an 8th followed by 2 16ths, but since the last 16th gets pushed back a bit, we get this shape where this note is longer than this one, which is longer than this one. It's like a little rhythmic ramp, picking up speed as it goes before dropping you onto the next beat to start over. Although again, he doesn't play exactly this pattern every time. The most common change he makes is leaving the last 16th note out, so that ramping effect is only there sporadically, keeping it feeling exciting when it does happen instead of getting repetitive. The last thing I want to mention in the hi-hat part is the way Wonder's playing emphasizes the upbeats. In most bars, he's hitting on every 8th note at least, but he tends to hit harder on the 8ths that aren't on the beats, contrasting the kick pattern and pulling your sense of rhythm into a more laid-back vibe. It's kinda like the backbeat the snare is playing, but at a smaller rhythmic scale, and if you listen to it, you can really feel the gravity of those upbeat 8ths. This drum groove is so good that he gives us 4 full bars of it before bringing in the rest of the band, but eventually we do get some more instruments, so let's move on to the drum's best friend, the bass. And here's the weird thing, when I listen to that part by itself, it feels syncopated. This is a thing that gets talked about a lot in music circles. Technically speaking, without accompaniment, there's no difference between this, where the attacks are on the beats, and this, where they're not, and when you play them with MIDI like I just did, they do sound exactly the same. And why shouldn't they? They're the same notes with the same duration. The only thing that's changed is their position relative to the beat, but if no one's playing the beat, how would you know? And yet if you take these two rhythms and give them to a good session player, they'll probably play them a little bit differently. It can be hard to define exactly what that difference is, but if your sense of groove is as strong as Stevie Wonder's, then at a deep fundamental level, beats and upbeats just aren't quite the same. Upbeats have a bit more bounciness to them, and to my ears at least, these attacks feel like upbeats. Of course they're not. If you listen to the song, the bass part lines up perfectly with that 4 on the floor rhythm from the kick, but something about his phrasing manages to make these attacks feel syncopated even though they're on the beat, which further contributes to the overall funkiness of the groove. The other main feature of the bass part is this fill at the end of every other bar, where we go from the E-flat root we've been playing up to G-flat, walk down to D-flat, then slide back up to E-flat. These notes are the flat 3 and flat 7 of our key, which are what's known as guide tones. They're the two notes that most clearly define the sound of an E-flat minor 7 chord, so they're good notes to use when you want to add some decoration without losing that tonality. This keeps us planted squarely in the single chord we're playing for this whole verse, while still breaking up that constant quarter note pulse with something a little more interesting. In terms of song form, this riff is positioned underneath the parts of the verse where Wonder is singing, giving a little extra support to his vocals before backing off to let the keyboard shine in between. Speaking of which, let's move on to the keyboards. There's two main lines here, one pan to the right, the other to the left. We'll start with the right-hand one, because this is almost certainly the part you're most familiar with. It's one of the most iconic riffs ever recorded, and what's fascinating to me about it is that I don't think it's immediately obvious that these two bars are actually different. I mean, they are, but on first listen, I think a lot of people miss that, and I'd like to look at why. The obvious, and I believe correct answer, is the rhythm. These two bars have the same rhythm, and in such an intensely groove-based piece of music, that's easily going to override the slight differences in pitch. In fact, even if I just play the rhythm, that still sounds like Superstition to me, so what makes this so distinct? Well, I break it up into two halves. The first half is just straight eighths. There's no syncopation at all here. Like we saw with the snare drum, sometimes creating a funky groove is just as much about when you choose to play on the beat as when you play off it. This string of eighth notes walks you into the groove before hitting you with the back half, where, yeah, there's some syncopation. Surprise! This part feels like a pattern called the tresillo, where you try to fit 3 attacks into 8 beats, forcing you to chop off the end of the last one in order to get it to fit and leading to a sort of lopsided groove that's common in Latin music. Here, the last attack is decorated by these little scratchy attacks on either side to fill out the groove a bit more. In terms of notes, this back half relies largely on guide tones again, leaning on G-flat and D-flat in much the same way the bass did and for largely the same reasons. But let's look at the first half again. Wonder alternates between this, where we're mostly on E-flat, starting on this really low one, jumping up an octave, then doing a little turnaround on the D-flat before stepping back up, and this, which starts on A-flat, the 4th, then walks up through the scale back to E-flat at the end. The first version solidifies our sense of tonality, strongly emphasizing the root, while the second one takes us on more of a journey, even starting on a note from outside that E-flat minor 7 chord we're so used to. It's the more colorful of the two by a wide margin, but it still feels comfortable because we keep balancing it out with the first one. And finally, we have the left keyboard. It's the most syncopated part of the groove. We start on the first upbeat, then get a new attack every 3/16 notes. This means that over the course of the first bar, we get a note on every part of the beat. We even get one right on beat 3, but because of the surrounding context, it doesn't really feel like a downbeat. The second bar switches things up, replacing that walking line with some scratches before playing this figure on beat 3, which, as we saw with the bass, is where Wonder does his singing. The relative emptiness of the second bar makes this feel almost like a counterline to those vocals, leaning on a big flashy rhythm when there's no singing, and then backing off and inviting the vocals into the space it's creating. The 2-bar structure also sets it apart from the other keyboard part, operating on a longer rhythmic scale to add more different layers to the groove. This line is also the most interesting in terms of notes, largely because it contains C natural. As I mentioned, we're in E-flat minor, but E-flat minor should have a C flat. Using C natural instead moves us into a different scale called Dorian, which is like minor, but it uses a major 6th. Dorian is a great scale for when you want to sound minor but not sad, which fits the vibe of Superstition perfectly. It's making light of some traditionally serious, somber subject matter, so the darkness of minor coupled with that playful major 6th really brings that mood to life. This is also, as far as I can tell, the only part of the verse that uses that C natural. We've already looked at most of the other instruments, and the vocal melody is in minor pentatonic, which doesn't use any kind of sixth, so that Dorian sound is buried in one of the most subtle parts of the whole groove, like Wonder is kind of winking at you through the music. Halfway through the verse, we're joined by the horns, adding yet another layer of rhythm. It starts similar to that second keyboard part with a dotted eighth rhythm, then turns around into this, which uses all the 16th notes for 2 whole beats except for the one that falls on beat 4. This lets the last 16th of beat 3 hang over a bit more, shining a spotlight on that incredibly unstable rhythmic position. Here's what it sounds like if we add an attack on beat 4. Yeah, that sucks. The jump you get from that missing note makes all the difference. The syncopation is even emphasized by the melody. We're walking up the scale, so we're really expecting to get the root on that downbeat, but instead it stops just short both rhythmically and melodically, delaying our return to the root until the very end of the bar. From there, we get a similar start to the second bar with an added D flat for decoration, and then this, where we abandon the syncopation entirely and just walk down an E flat minor triad in straight eighths. Why? Well, this starts on beat 3 of the second bar, and as you hopefully remember by now, that's where the vocals are. And that's the horns, which... Wait, are we done? Did I do it? Did we build the whole groove? Yeah, I think we did. Awesome, thanks for watching. I'll see you next... Wait a second, this song has a chorus, doesn't it? Okay, fortunately we don't have to start from scratch. The groove keeps going here, largely driven by the drums, while most of the other instruments switch to playing some form of pad or chord voicing. There's some fun rhythmic stuff going on here for sure, but this section is much more reliant on harmony. Check it out. What we're basically doing here is starting on B-flat 7, the 5 chord, then sliding it around by half step, first up to B7, then down to A7. Overall, this feels like an excursion to the 5, which is a pretty common approach to breaking up long strings of the 1, but the extra chords on either side add a whole lot of spiciness. It's kinda like a slow harmonic trill, encircling the B-flat to really emphasize it while leaning on some unexpected notes and chords along the way. Honestly, these planning dominant chords sound pretty spooky to me, which fits well with the theme of the song. From that trill shape, we'd expect the A7 to slide back up to B-flat 7, but instead it goes down, letting us sit on the 4 chord for a bit before popping back up to 5 and setting up a rhythm stop that gives us a second to rest after the harmonically complex chorus before diving right back into the rhythmically complex verse. Or actually, we get this little horn lick first, played over the verse loop as a little transition to wind us down and settle back into that groove. It also features that C natural we saw in the keyboard lick, making that Dorian flavor a bit more obvious. Then those sections repeat a couple times until we wind up in the outro, where Wonder loops the groove while the horns play all their various lines from throughout the song, including the chorus part that was supposed to go over a completely different progression, but because we're already familiar with it, it manages to sound great in this new context too. And that's basically it. Or I mean, no, it's not. As I said at the beginning, there's a million little flourishes in here to discover, and I didn't even touch on the vocals, but if you need me to tell you that Stevie Wonder has an amazing vocal tone and a gift for melodic embellishment, then you've probably never heard a Stevie Wonder song, so why are you watching this video? But ultimately, that's not what Superstition is about. Superstition is a testament to the power of groove, with lots of different rhythms operating at different timescales, all coming together to create one brilliant song. Anyway, before I go, I wanted to mention that there's a 12-tone Discord server. I mean, it's been around for like a year and a half, but I've only mentioned it in one video so far because I'm bad at having a Discord. But it exists, and it's full of people who like talking about music, so if that's something you're interested in, then you might be interested in it. There's a link in the description if you are. And hey, thanks for watching. As always, this song was chosen by my patrons on Patreon. The poll to pick the next one goes up over there next week. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.